Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to allow people to stream in from the lobby. There's still a few people joining us. Right. Okay, we've got a lot to get through, so I think I'll start. As I said, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to see such a strong attendance and lots of you being quite keen. Already waiting in the lobby before 9:30. So that's great to see. My name is Haroon Chowdhury, and I'm the Director of Evidence and Insights at GambleAware. I'll start with some quick introductions. I'm Haroon. I'm joined alongside myself by Priyanka Roy Chowdhury, who is our Quantitative Insights Lead. And from YouGov, I'm delighted to be joined by Kate Goschalk, who is an Associate Director, and Jack McIntosh, who is a Qualitative Research Executive. Now, we've got just under an hour, 58 minutes for this webinar, including time for discussion and Q&A. So the main presentation will be Kate and Jack talking through some key trends in the treatment and support survey over the last 5 years. Priyanka will then talk briefly through the tools that we have created based on the treatment and support survey to make gambling harms data available at a local area level. Finally, we do, of course, have space for discussion and Q&A. Now, as in previous years, this event is being recorded and will be available to view afterwards. And we've got time at the end for discussion and Q&A, but I would encourage people to submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function. And so, you know, if you get that in first, then we can try and pick those up first. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible, but if you do have a question that we weren't able to answer, you can always contact us after the event at info@gambleaware.org. Now, before I move on to the main event, the presentation from YouGov, I'd just like to say a few words from a GambleAware perspective. This year marks the publication of the 5th and final treatment and support survey, which has been carried out independently by YouGov each year since 2020. We have been commissioning this survey to give us data and insights to help us and others design and commission public health approaches to gambling harms. The most recent report, containing the overall findings from the 2024 survey, was published last month on our website. I'll see if I can find a way to share a link to that. In order to maximize the public benefit of the research, we have made all of the findings, data tables, and raw data publicly available, so that everyone who has an interest in gambling harms, from policymakers through to commissioners, providers, and other charities, can use this evidence to inform their own work. We have a dedicated page on our website where you can find all of the reports and data sets that have been produced using this survey over the years, and I'll find a way to share that link as well so that people have access to it. Now, obviously, the treatment and support survey is far from the only source of data on gambling harms. And you know, last week we saw the launch of the most recent gambling survey for Great Britain from the Gambling Commission. But over the years, what the treatment and support survey has done is be the first, if not only, data source to provide evidence on certain topics and emerging issues, and that's what I'd really like to focus on. So one of its major contributions has been to help us broaden our understanding of how many people are affected in some way by gambling harm, going beyond PGSI scores. This survey provided the first source of evidence on the number of people who are affected others, which is now some 8% of the population, around 4.3 million people, which means we now know how many people have been adversely affected by their own gambling or someone else's. And altogether, that's around 5.7 million people in the latest data. On top of that, this survey was the first to try and quantify the number of children who might be affected others because they are living with an adult who has problem gambling. That's now around 2.2 million children under 18. And last year, the survey gave us the first ever estimate, as far as we're aware, of the number of people who might be experiencing legacy harms as a result of their previous gambling. When you put all of this together, you get a much richer understanding of how gambling harms affect the whole population, not just a small minority of individuals now, but everyone around them, as well as their future selves. And we've used this rich national picture to support local action, taking this evidence to local areas up and down the country and giving them novel data on the scale of gambling harms in their area specifically. And that is some work that Priyanka will talk more about later on. But as well as highlighting the scale of the problem, the survey has given us crucial insights on how to design solutions. It's shown us that the number one reason why people don't access sport is the shame and embarrassment that they feel. This has inspired our award-winning campaigns to get people to open up about gambling and to end gambling-related stigma. The survey has also shown us that there's a large population of people out there who do want to quit or reduce gambling, but don't want to use a service or speak to someone. And meeting the needs of that group has inspired the suite of innovative digital tools that we've developed, including a self-assessment tool, a spend calculator, and a self-help app most recently. And lastly, the survey has given us valuable insights on policy issues that might inform debates around gambling regulation. This includes really important data on public attitudes towards gambling marketing and the National Lottery, as well as evidence on products that aren't classified as gambling officially, but which may still cause people to experience gambling harms or gambling-like harms, for example, prize draws. As I said earlier, this is the last treatment and support survey, and while I'm sad to see it come to an end, my overwhelming feeling as I look back on it is pride at how it's really pushed the boundaries of what we know and enabled us to do some really groundbreaking work. Now, as many of you know, we're entering a new gambling harm system from April of next year, and we very much hope that the evidence base we have built here will support the new commissioners and others in understanding, preventing, and responding to gambling harms. So with that, all of that said, I will now hand over to Kate and Jack from YouGov, who will take you through a small selection of the greatest hits and key trends in the data over the years.
Thank you very much, Arun. So as we mentioned, there is obviously a lot of data that we've collected from 2019 onwards, and in some places we'll be focusing on 2020 onwards. So really our hope for today is that you'll come away with a really good understanding of some of the headline figures we've seen. And if you want to find out more, there is the full report published. So we'll start by talking you through the method. And there's kind of two main parts to treatment and support. On one side, we've got the big quantitative survey. So we survey around 18,000 adults per year. And what's great about this is the large sample size means we can be really confident in the findings that we see, and we know that they're really robust. Fieldwork took place this year going into November, December, typically around October, November. And we'll mention the potential significance of that slightly later. And we also made one tweak to the sampling and weight scheme this year to align it with the latest census data. We know that this hasn't affected the figures that we see, and this is something that we can kind of, again, touch on slightly later. But on top of the survey, we also think it's really important to hear from people with lived experience in other ways. And for that reason, we always do some form of qualitative research. So this year we conducted 20 interviews of people who gamble, and had a specific focus on those who'd recently started gambling, so we can get a better sense of the kind of new generation of people who gamble. In previous years, we've also done things like focus groups. So last year we did focus groups for affected others, and Jack will be talking through some of those findings slightly later. And I really do think it is this combination of the large survey that gives us those kind of key stats that we can track over time, along with hearing about people's lived experiences through qualitative research, that makes this research so impactful. So we'll start by looking at gambling harm, and we do this using a measure called PGSI. And before I go into this, I will mention that the Gambling Commission produced the official statistics on PGSI. So the reason for mentioning this today is just because we have that kind of longer time frame now. We've got 5 years worth of data to look at. And also this is a really useful way to contextualize some of the findings that we see. For anyone unfamiliar with the term PGSI, it stands for the Problem Gambling Severity Index. And it's basically a way of assessing gambling-related harms or problems by showing people 9 different statements, including, have you ever bet more than you can afford to lose? Have you ever gone back and chased your losses? And we then give people a score based on their answers, where a higher score denotes a higher level of gambling-related problems. And for the purpose of this presentation, we'll focus on 2 groups. One is those with a PGSI score of 1+, that is anyone experiencing any level of gambling problems. And the second is anyone with a PGSI score of 8+, that is anyone experiencing problem gambling. And what we've seen when we look at PGSI over time is actually a fairly stable picture from 2020 till 2023 in terms of the proportion falling into these categories. This year, between 2023 and 2024, we saw an increase in those classified as PGSI 1+, so experiencing any level of gambling problems, and also 8+, experiencing problem gambling. And we did look into a couple of reasons for this that we wanted to rule out. So firstly, I mentioned that we updated the sampling and weight scheme this year. The reason for that is we had updated ethnicity data from the census for all nations, which we didn't previously. Now, what we've seen in Great Britain is a shift to a higher proportion of ethnic minorities within the population. And so we wanted to ensure that our sample accurately reflected that now we had these updated statistics. However, we know that ethnic minorities are more likely to experience gambling-related harm than their white counterparts. So for this reason, we basically ran 2 sets of tables, one using our new method and one using our old method. And these figures were pretty much exactly the same. So we're very confident that this methodological change didn't impact the figures that we see. The second thing we wanted to look into was the fieldwork timings. I mentioned that typically fieldwork take place in October, November. This time it was slightly later, going into December. Now, there is research, for example, from GamCare, suggesting that people are more likely to gamble over the Christmas period. That said, we didn't see a change in participation, which I'll show slightly later. And PGSI asked about the past 12 months. So it's unlikely someone would give a wildly different answer in December than they would November, though it is plausible this could have had a small impact. Just kind of comparing these to the Gambling Commission stats, actually what we see is very similar. Our method is a pure online survey, whereas theirs is push to web. And both of these figures are within about 1 percentage point. So that does give us very high levels of confidence in these statistics that we see. And then we also looked into what is driving this increase. And I'm aware this is a fairly busy slide, but basically what we've got here is the proportion of different gender and age categories who are experiencing any level of gambling-related problems and also experiencing problem gambling, and that's the blue and purple bars on the slide. And the main things to pull out here are this is really being driven by men and also young people, and then when we put that together, more specifically young men, and this is something that there is kind of wide evidence to suggest as well. What I think is interesting when we look at the 18 to 34 bracket is whilst for men, we've just seen that increase between 2023 and 2024, actually for our 18 to 24 group, this has been a kind of longer trend. So 17% of 18 to 34s were classified as PGSI 1+ in November 2020. That is now 25%. And the proportion experiencing problem gambling was 5%, and that is now 8%. So that's probably the biggest increase that we've seen. We also look at this in terms of ethnicity, and you can see here that actually, when it comes to ethnicity, we've seen increases in both the proportion of white people classified as PGSI 1+ and 8+, and also ethnic minorities classified as 1+ and 8+. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a sense of some of the patterns we've seen when it comes to gambling-related harms. There has been that small increase between 2023 and 2024, and as ever, more research would be needed to kind of confirm this trend. We've also looked at gambling participation within the survey, and we do this by asking people a huge range of different gambling activities they may have participated in the past 12 months, and then we also ask this about the past 4 weeks. So this will range from anything from online casino games to sports betting, but also does include the lottery. So it is worth noting that when we talk about people who gamble, that may include people who've only done the lottery perhaps once or twice within that year versus people who gamble perhaps every day. And that's the reason that we tend to break down the data by PGSI, so looking at those experiencing harm as opposed to just people who gamble. And we tried to map out some of the trends that we've seen since 2020. And what we've actually found is participation has stayed pretty stable over this time period at around 6 in 10 adults within Great Britain saying they participated in at least one gambling activity over the past 12 months. The biggest kind of change to that was with COVID. So in 2020, that fell from 61% to 56%, still a fairly small decrease. And that came at a time that sports events were being cancelled, people were no longer able to go into gambling venues. And we did see that trend reverse as we moved into 2021 and things started to open up slowly. Since then, participation has remained pretty stable at around 6 in 10. But what's been happening below the surface is an increase in online forms of gambling. And the particular ones to pull out here are an increase in online sports betting, which has risen from 12% to 15% since 2019 when we began tracking, and also online casino games, which has actually doubled from 3% to 6%. Why I think this is interesting is these are activities which are more likely to be associated with gambling-related harm. So if this trend continues, that could indicate that gambling harm could increase. And then we've spoken a bit about people who gamble currently, but as Aru mentioned, this is also one of the first surveys which has looked into legacy harms. And I guess the reason for this was we know about people who gamble and there is kind of extensive research on this group, but from that we also know that when someone stops gambling, it's not necessarily that's it, or it's an easy journey to quitting and reducing. And we wanted to get a better understanding of what the population of people who used to gamble but don't currently look like, and also whether they're still experiencing harms today. And I guess that's quite important when we're thinking about treatment and support and ensuring that it meets the needs of everyone. And we found that 13% of the population in Great Britain said they used to gamble but do not currently. And then we asked them to kind of think back to when they gamble and showed them that same set of PGSI questions. And we found that of that group, around 15% were experiencing any level of gambling problems at the time. So that's very similar to what we see when we're asking people who do currently. But what I think is really interesting here is we asked people what issues they had experienced at the time, and then also whether they were still experiencing any issues now. At the time, we found that of our PGSI 3+ category, so that is anyone experiencing moderate or problem levels of gambling, and we grouped them together due to small base sizes, over half said they were experiencing issues. But then we also asked that within the last 12 months. These are people who haven't gambled in the last 12 months. However, 3 in 10 were still experiencing some form of issue, and that was most commonly financial, but a range of different impacts are mentioned. With that, we also found that 18% of this group still had the urge to gamble, and that rose to 46%, so just under half of those with higher PGSI scores. So I think this really highlights the need to kind of continue the conversation about those experiencing legacy harms and highlights the idea that gambling harm isn't unique to people who gamble currently.
Yeah, so we're now going to look at the, what Kate was just talking about, some of those stats. We're going to look at the qualitative research, which really helps bring a bit of colour to it. And we did find in the qual research that the impacts of gambling amongst people who used to gamble were still very strongly felt. Of course, like these impacts can sometimes be financial. As we know, starting gambling as a way of winning money is very common, though in reality, many people lose money from gambling and chase their losses. That might involve borrowing money, stealing, lying, and getting into debt, potentially leading to financial trouble down the line, which doesn't necessarily go away overnight, and also damage relationships with loved ones. So you can see this quote down the bottom where someone said, "I felt like I couldn't stop. It would just always be one more go, but I couldn't go until I'd lost all my money." And then, of course, people also spoke about emotional distress, which doesn't end overnight either. The emotional impacts of gambling can be extremely wide-ranging, and it's common for those who gamble to experience coexisting mental health conditions, such as depression and anxiety. It's possible that these conditions sometimes precede a gambling addiction or gambling behaviors, but sometimes they can come as a result of it instead. For example, the stigma associated with gambling can lead many to keep it a secret, causing feelings of guilt, embarrassment, and shame. And those feelings can spiral into greater emotional distress and can linger for quite a long time. And as well as that, as Kay was mentioning before, for many people, there is that pull to return to gambling. And in 2022, our findings highlighted how these impacts can be very long lasting, showing that once an individual has stopped gambling, the pull to return to it can be very strong. Having poor mental health and drinking alcohol were also key triggers for some people, making participants feel weaker or unable to control their desire to gamble. So when we're looking at legacy harms, when we looked at them in the 2023 research, we found that there was really no one-size-fits-all approach to stopping gambling. That is something we've realized over the years in general, but this was definitely the case with legacy harms. When we interviewed people in 2023, they highlighted that decreasing the stigma surrounding gambling is essential to empower people who gamble to accept that gambling has a negative impact on their life and to get support from other sources. The findings did underline some commonalities in the quitting journeys of those who used to gamble. One of the main ones is people spoke about needing to have sort of the personal resolve to quit, like the will to quit in itself. There was a recognition that stopping gambling is essentially impossible without this type of personal resolve. And that might sometimes come from hitting rock bottom. So that could include realizing how much money you've spent, how personal relationships have broken down, or even just the strong impact it's had on your mental health. And in terms of like the first steps to quitting, people spoke about talking to someone as being a really powerful part of that journey, or setting gambling limits and blockers. In the interviews, people who used to gamble generally spoke about the positive impact of opening up about their gambling and gaining accountability for their gambling behaviors. So as you can see, just beneath that box in the middle there, someone says, I think it's just talking to anyone really, because I think as soon as you tell someone, there's someone there to hold you to account. And then finally, we've got resisting the urge to gamble. So participants in the 2023 research suggested that passing of time is a really key factor in quitting gambling for good, explaining that the urges to gamble slowly reduced over time. When people experienced urges or spoke about having experienced urges, this was usually due to seeing something associated with gambling. That could be a scratch card in a supermarket or an advert on TV, a pop-up on their phone. And that really does highlight the negative influence of external factors that people can't control. So if you're already predisposed to have to engage in gambling behaviors, then if there's lots of external things going on which might influence you, then that can be a really powerful trigger. I'll pass you back over to Kate now.
Thank you, Jack. So obviously a really important part of this survey is the focus on treatment and support. And I guess that was really the reason this survey was set up in the first place. So we've got a few slides on this, which probably doesn't do justice to how much data we have collected, but hopefully will give you a bit of a sense of some of the trends we've seen. And when we talk about advice, support and treatment, we mean anything from speaking to friends and family, using self-help apps, all the way to speaking to a GP and seeking more specialist gambling related support. So it is very broad. And we ask people which of those different types of advice, support and treatment they have used in the past 12 months, we call that usage, and also whether they would want something going forward, and that's our demand category. And what we see is actually quite a high number of people experiencing problem gambling saying that they've used something and that they want something going forward. And in terms of the trends we've seen, there has been an increase between 2023 and 2024 in terms of the proportion experiencing any level of gambling harms. That's our PDSI 1+ bar in blue, which has risen from 23% to 30% when we're kind of looking forward. Now, it is interesting to see kind of real world data about this too. And there is data to show that there have also been increased numbers to the National Gambling Helpline, increased registrations to GamBan and GamStop in this time period. So it is interesting when you see that survey data kind of marrying up with the real world data. What we do see here is that these figures are very similar for usage and demand. The reason for that is in many cases people might have used something in the past 12 months and want to continue doing so in the next 12 months. But I think what this really does speak to is that there is kind of high demand for advice, support and treatment, especially for those who are experiencing high level of problems from their gambling. And we have looked into the barriers to reaching this over the years, and we've kind of netted these into a few broad categories because there are quite a lot of different barriers people might experience. And what's interesting is how these vary depending on the level of harm or problem someone's experiencing from their gambling. So the most common reason among PGSI 1+ is not considering gambling a problem, not thinking it's risky, they're only betting small amounts. And this may be the case for some people who gamble. It might be that they're only gambling every now and then versus others who are gambling more frequently and at more kind of higher amounts of money. Then there's also not thinking treatment and support is relevant or suitable, which I guess kind of speaks to the point of making sure that it does feel like it is something that is for everyone. I think sometimes people can think my problem isn't bad enough, which can kind of put them off seeking support. But what we do see, and this is something Haroon mentioned earlier, is stigma standing out as the most common barrier among those experiencing high level of gambling related problems. So that's 24% of those experiencing problem gambling. Now, this is interesting because there has obviously been a lot of work done by GambleAware to kind of combat the stigma around gambling with some great media coverage of people talking about their gambling journeys and seeking support, but it does really enforce the idea that we do need to be kind of continuing these campaigns and encouraging people to seek support when needed.
So just building on that idea that we were speaking about previously about the need to have personal resolve or sort of self-will to quit, the qualitative research has really highlighted how users of treatment support need to feel ready to receive treatment and support. So we've repeatedly explored how stigma and denial deter those who gamble and affected others from reducing their gambling or seeking support for gambling. As you can see in one of the quotes down below, it takes a while to accept that you have a problem and that you're spending too much money. There's also an embarrassment factor. It's hard to admit you have a problem and be able to talk about it with people. The 2021 findings showed that once people have realized the negative impact that gambling has had on them or someone they know, they are often willing to access treatment and support. So it's really a process of needing to realize and sort of take stock of what's going on. However, a key concern was that gambling treatment and support is confidential and discreet. So for those who gamble, the need for continuous support and aftercare was also highlighted. And in terms of treatment and support preferences, particularly regarding sort of whether support should be remote or face-to-face, there was a lot of conflicting attitudes, and this all came down to different participants' ages, personalities, and digital confidence. And they really illustrated the importance of having an array of support styles available. On one hand, face-to-face was generally felt to be higher quality, but critiqued for feeling too intimate and open for some. For example, some people generally feel uncomfortable talking about their mental health, maybe in general, but also with a stranger, and potentially also when it's about something as personal and I guess you could say still taboo as gambling. Meanwhile, remote support was praised for being convenient and less judgmental, in the sense that it's less personal, but that might work better for some. But then some in the 2020 research flagged remote support as potentially poorer quality because you're less able to express the right tone via chat or email. And there's also some issues surrounding confidentiality for some people, especially during the 2020 research. We found that during the pandemic, people found it difficult to access a private space. So they didn't really feel like they could do remote support online or something, or when someone else was in the room with them.
Thank you, Jack. So in this next mini section, we'll look at affected others. And I guess we've spoken now about people who gamble, people who used to gamble, and this is our kind of third audience who might be experiencing harms from gambling. And an affected other for the purpose of our survey is anyone who knows someone who gambles and self-reports they've been negatively affected by this. And that equates to 8% of the population within Great Britain. And similar to the types of questions that we ask people who gamble, We also asked a question to affected others around whether they've sought advice or support and whether they'd also want some advice and support going forwards. And what's interesting here is between 2022 and 2023, we saw an increase in both usage and demand among affected others. And that was sustained going into 2024 this year. So now we find that just over 2 in 5, 44%, said they would like some form of advice and support. And it is worth noting this might be very casual. It might just be speaking to someone, which they may not have done already. However, what this says to me is that affected others are a group which do kind of need to be considered in the same way that we're kind of thinking about people who gamble. If someone close to you gambles and you're kind of getting the knock-on impacts, that can still have quite large impacts on your life. And I think that's something that we've explored more in the qualitative research, which Jack will touch on.
Thank you, Kate. So the qualitative findings have essentially consistently shown that affected others can be significantly impacted by others' gambling behaviours, and that these impacts can be extensive and long-lasting. We found it's common for affected others to feel an array of negative emotions due to someone else's gambling, such as anger, anxiety, betrayal, and distrust. Relationships can become strained and sometimes even permanently damaged by gambling due to the combination of emotional, financial, and practical impacts. And the 2020 research found that most affected others sought help due to mental health problems, concern for their safety or well-being, or needing help and not really knowing how to deal with the situation. So in other words, it felt like affected others often sought help and support, treatment and support, only really when it was a last resort for them, like they didn't really know how else to deal with the situation. And now we'll just take a closer look at some of those other barriers that affected others might face in seeking support. The most cited barriers in the core research was in accessing, was centered around beliefs that the available advice or support would not be relevant. For example, think the levels of gambling that the person they know who gambles are engaging in are not serious enough to warrant seeking help, or that any treatment or support would not be effective. There was definitely a sense of hopelessness among some affected others about their situation, or this feeling that the person who gambles just wouldn't be willing to receive help, or wouldn't be willing to continue seeking help. And illustrating this, in the 2021 interviews, affected others felt that not considering gambling to be a problem is the main barrier to seeking support, because it can be very hard to convince those who gamble to reflect on their behaviour and seek help. As mentioned, findings have also revealed that stigma and embarrassment prevent affected others from reaching out for support, with it felt that gambling is perceived differently to other addictions like drugs and alcohol. Affected others often fear judgment, which can lead them to hide or avoid someone else's gambling. And this just really demonstrates the need to address the stigma around support seeking and gambling addiction in general. We can move on. So the qualitative research has repeatedly demonstrated a clear demand for tailored support and information designed with affected others in mind. In all of the studies where affected others were interviewed, participants highlighted the need for increased awareness about what gambling addiction is. So that might include common information about the common signs of what addiction looks like, possible triggers which might cause someone to gamble, and the potential impacts of gambling as well. They also called for improved access to advice and guidance on supporting someone who gambles, as well as the availability of emotional and practical support. So yes, as it says here, practical support might include practical tips for navigating the day-to-day impacts of someone else's gambling. So there's really an array of different types of support that are needed there. And overall, participants described an appetite for better signposted, more readily available, free and confidential advice and support. If we were to kind of envision what improved affected other support might look like in a bit more detail, one thing they really called for was better signposting of organisations that affected others can consult for support, either for themselves or for someone who gambles. Interestingly, in the 2021 interviews, some affected others mentioned that most online gambling forums are created for people who gamble, and that they'd like to see more resources dedicated to those who are impacted by someone else's gambling. It was raised that having dedicated forums for speaking to other affected others would provide a really good form of community support, where affected others could chat to each other, share tips and coping mechanisms, and also just engage in emotional and practical support. There's a strong need for flexible support systems that are available when affected others need them, because the need for timely support can change, and it can be very acute at times and less acute at other times. You can see this a quote down the bottom which says it goes through phases, it can be quiet and then become really acute. So we need different support in different stages. So therefore, having easy access to remote and face-to-face support was felt to be an incredibly important aspect to providing treatment and support. And then finally, we have access to counselling and talking therapy, because as we've seen, affected others might need to navigate some fairly large, like, emotional challenges related to somebody else's gambling, so they need a space in which they can talk about that.
Thank you. And then we now come to the final mini section within mine and Jack's presentation. And this is jumping to something slightly different, which is gambling, advertising and regulation, which we had a bit of a deep dive into this year, but has come up in previous years as well. And we had a couple of different questions on this, one being around whether people thought there were too many, too few, or about the right amount of gambling, advertising and sponsorships on a range of different platforms. And what we found here is there was quite high consensus that this was too high when it came to TV, social media and sports grounds. Though slightly lower selected this when we came to public transport, video games, podcasts. And what is interesting is when you look at TV, social media and sports grounds, we've got quite similar amounts of the general public and those experiencing some level of problems from their gambling reporting these. Whereas when we look at video games and podcasts specifically, those experiencing gambling related problems, so PGSI 8+, are more likely to say there are too many. So that's 43% on video games and 37% on podcasts. And I wonder if it's because that group are kind of more tuned into these, so perhaps more likely to notice them. But what came out of the qualitative research is that it's not about any one individual platform, and respondents actually felt that it was the aggregated consumer experience that felt too much. So when you are having them within football games, also on TV, and also in things like games, that's when it all does feel too high. And then we asked about how people felt around a range of different types of bans. We found quite high support when we asked about a ban on gambling advertising pre-watershed. And there was also support for making it mandatory for gambling adverts to include independent and evidence-led health warnings of effective signposting to support. And we've done some work with GambleAware that's looked into potential new messages that might be used instead of take time to think. But what's interesting here is we find more support than oppose a ban on all gambling advertising in the UK. So 53% of the general public, a small majority, but that compares to 18% who opposed it. And what we have found in the research is that this is because people essentially think that gambling kind of sells itself in the same way that perhaps smoking does. Even if there wasn't advertising for gambling, people would still kind of be drawn to it. So that is something interesting to take away from this.
Thanks, Kate. And if we're just to look a little bit deeper into the qualitative findings about advertising and marketing, overwhelmingly, participants have highlighted that excessive advertising and insufficient regulation can have clear and potentially very serious effects. In 2022 and 2024, the research shed light on gambling, with participants revealing that exposure at an early age, such as when watching the National Lottery with family members, for example, was really fundamental to their gambling journey, and they evidenced clear concern about exposing children to gambling advertising. As we've just seen, that could be on TV, it could be on mobile phone games and apps, and many other places. This really felt particularly concerning, given the difficulty that parents would face trying to prevent or restrict their children from seeing content like this. So if it's on their phone, there's very little that a parent can really do in certain situations to prevent them from seeing that. Someone says down below, with smartphones, it's so easy to access stuff like that. In terms of gambling adverts, they get on their phones, and if it's the free version, you've got to watch an ad. I don't think it's right. And people just spoke about gambling advertising as being a barrier to stopping or reducing gambling for someone who does want to ultimately quit or reduce. Research from 2023 and 24 highlighted how the prevalence of gambling advertising can act as a barrier. With it widely felt the pervasiveness of gambling adverts is very problematic and that it acts to draw people in, especially encouraging gambling around sports. In the 2024 interviews, some also mentioned gambling advertising being the main trigger for them to start or restart gambling, with some recalling the specific advert that inspired them to start. So I remember one in particular, someone hadn't gambled for a while and then they saw a Barbara Windsor advert on TV, which inspired them to gamble for the first time in a few months. And then another really important factor that people spoke about, some people felt that, particularly participants new to gambling interviewed in the 2024 study, felt the gambling companies are able to make misleading claims within their advertising, particularly around the odds of winning. This was mostly associated with advertising geared towards new users. Given that many in the sample had started gambling to make money during the cost of living crisis, many in the 2024 research spotlighted gambling advertising as being exploitative in the current economic climate. So this element of the research where we looked at advertising marketing really highlighted the potential dangers behind the prevalence of gambling advertising, with participants showing high levels of support for greater restrictions and some mentioning bans on advertising entirely. And that brings us to the end of the slides that we prepared at YouGov, so I'll hand back over to Haroon, I think. Or Priyanka, in fact.
Yep. Yeah, thanks very much, Kate and Jack. Huge amount of material there and some very deep insights combining both the quantitative and the qualitative findings over the years. Just a reminder to participants, you can ask questions through using the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many of them as we can depending on the time that we've got. Right, as I said earlier, one of the key things that we've used the treatment and support survey for is going from national to local and generating a local picture of what gambling harms might look like in a particular area, and then giving that information to local areas so that they can inform their own policy initiatives and projects and programs around gambling harms. And so here to talk more about that work is Priyanka.
Thank you, Haroon. So as Haroon mentioned, this section kind of highlights some of the work that we have done using data from our survey to better understand gambling harms at the local level across GB. So just to talk about how these local area estimates are produced, they are produced in fact by YouGov using a technique called multi-level regression and post-stratification, or in short, MRP. In practice, what MRP allows us is to take what we know about the demographic makeup of each local area, such as age, gender, and education, and match individuals from our wider national survey sample to those types of people in each place. The reason this approach is implemented is because even with a very large national sample, there wouldn't be enough respondents in each of our parliamentary constituencies or local authorities to analyze robustly. So this approach helps us to model the responses to key variables of interest and produce these indicative local estimates. These are then presented in the form of data profiles developed by OCSI. It's important to note that these figures are not precise local measures, but rather indicative estimates. It gives us a sense of how gambling harm and related behaviors are distributed across GB in relative terms. So what does this data include? It includes estimates on three main types of information. This includes prevalence of gambling harms, usage of and demand for treatment and support services, and the estimated fiscal cost of gambling problems in each local area. A bit about the fiscal cost. So the total fiscal cost of gambling in GB was estimated at around 14 billion per year by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and we have apportioned this figure to local areas using their relative prevalence of gambling problems. How this data is presented? This data is available as interactive maps and local area profiles on our website, which is created by Polymapper. These allow anyone to explore the figures by local authority, parliamentary constituency, or region and compare across areas. For those who are interested, we also have PDF files of the data profiles available on request. On the right, you can see an example of the map, which you can see on our website as well, which shows estimated prevalence of low level of problems. So basically, darker shades on the map represent higher levels of harm and helps us to quickly identify where gambling problems are more concentrated. Overall, this helps us make the national survey data locally relevant and helps support targeted interventions, funding decisions, and policy discussions at the regional and local levels. So that's all on our local area level data. I'll hand it back to Haroon.
Thanks very much, Priyanka. That's it. And that's a hugely important piece of work. I think we have just posted a link to that, to the local area heat maps. Yes, we have. That's available on our website, so anyone can go there, type in their local area or zoom in on the map, and you will see gambling harms data for any area in Britain, any local authority in Britain. Right. Thanks very much, Kate, Jack, and Priyanka, for giving us the tour of all of that evidence that we have produced and made available. We've now got a little bit of time now for questions, if anybody has one. Right. Okay, it looks like the first question I can see is, are there any similar findings from the treatment and support survey with the gambling survey for Great Britain that was published last week? And why does the treatment and support survey have different results than the GSGB? And I assume this is largely about prevalence. Kate, I think I will defer to you on this one, if that's okay.
Yes, I'm happy to take that. So, I mean, in terms of the similarities between both surveys, they obviously both ask about gambling participation and also PGSI, so kind of the idea around problem gambling. And there are some similarities there in terms of, I actually think, given the methods are different, the findings for PGSI are very similar, at estimating PGSI 1 plus around like 14, 15, 16%, and problem gambling at 3-4%. So I would say those findings are actually pretty similar. We also see similar patterns in terms of participation. So, for example, men being more likely to engage in certain activities. But to speak to, I guess, the differences between the two surveys, I know Patrick Sturgis has done a lot of work looking at why different surveys yield different findings. So really just kind of deferring to his work. But for example, our survey is online only, whereas the Gambling Commission survey is push to web, so people receive a letter and are then kind of prompted to go online. The surveys also take place at different times. So our survey takes place annually, whereas I think the GSGB takes place more regularly. And also that idea around when the surveys take place. So ours take place in the autumn, whereas theirs might take place at a slightly different time. So I do think it kind of makes sense to me that the findings might not be exactly the same from the different methods, but actually what we're seeing is a fairly consistent picture.
That's great. Thank you. We also have a question. While I've got you, I think it might be good to get you to pick up another question that's come in, related one. Obviously, our data shows quite significant PGSI increases over the last few years, and one of the questions is, are there specific age groups driving that? And I think there are, but I'll let you provide the answer in more detail.
Yeah, so it's definitely driven by young people, and then I guess also those within the middle age bracket, which we classify as 35 to 54, but it really is those who are 18 to 24, 18 to 34 who are kind of pushing that up. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also that link between age and gender, so it does tend to be young men who are driving that as opposed to young women.
Thanks very much. And related to that question, have we seen any trend in regions, particular regions driving seeing larger increases in prevalence?
Yeah, so we did see a larger increase in London this year. Some of that will also be due to where different populations are. So there is a kind of younger population in London more generally, but that's probably the region that stands out for seeing an increase.
All right. Thank you very much, Kate. Right, we have another question from Penny Reese. Is there a map to show local level prevalence of gambling advertising for comparison? I'll provide an initial answer, but others are very happy to jump. Others are very welcome to jump in. So that's not something we are currently able to measure. I don't think I've seen data on that. I think that you can find data on local area level prevalence of things like gambling establishments, gambling venues. I think you can use open source data methods to construct that. But I think and there might be some forms of advertising, things like council-owned billboards or things like that. Things that are quite fixed and quite well defined that you could kind of look at the geographic distribution of. So where those things have been measured, I think we know that they tend to be kind of concentrated in deprived areas or overrepresented in deprived areas. But I haven't seen anything more comprehensive. Those are just two particular facets of gambling advertising, where I know that data has been collected by other people, but it's not. I haven't seen a more kind of comprehensive measure of that in a sort of geospatial data series. But I'll allow anyone else to disagree with me if they wish. No, okay. Thank you very much for asking that question. And right. Right, another question. The research is really interesting. Is there a plan to continue doing something similar to continue trend tracking? I think going forward, there are other data sources on this on gambling harms. There is the Gambling Survey for Great Britain, which is the official source of statistics, particularly for gambling participation and gambling harms in terms of PGSI, and that carries forward some of the things here. It's got some really interesting questions on harms, particular types of harms as well. One of the things I think I hope we've done with the treatment of sport survey is make the case for why certain things are useful to measure. And I think the GSGB also includes data on affected others. I think it also includes data on usage of and access to support as well. So it is carrying on some of these things. Looks like another question on. Oh, sorry, but before I move on to that, Kate, was there anything you would like to add on to that question?
I guess from a YouGov perspective, we've obviously been working on this for a number of years now. So we have been having some internal discussions about whether we do some kind of internal piece that might act as a bit of a spin-off from some of the research that we have. But we're always open to ideas if anyone does have anything they want to explore or any kind of communication they want to do. Please do get in touch with myself or Jack and we'd be happy to chat.
That's great. Thank you very much. Right. I could see another question that has come in. Someone has asked, does the increase in harm suggest that none of the policy interventions have had any effect to date? And that's a very interesting question, a very challenging question. It's so the treatment of sport survey data has shown an increase in harm. The gambling survey data has shown a smaller increase in harm, and according to that data. So the first thing is, different data sets do give you different answers about whether harm has increased. And I think the gambling commission's view would be that the overall kind of aggregate level of harm is statistically flat, I think they would say. But showing whether we can attribute it to policy interventions is always a very difficult question. Because there's lots of things going on at the same time. We can't, and it's difficult to undertake attribution. So there have been policy measures implemented as a result of the white paper. At the same time, you have lots of other factors going on. You have lots of other kind of cultural, economic, social factors all going on at the same time. You also have kind of cost of living crisis. You have other factors that we know kind of may contribute to gambling harms from a kind of public health perspective. deprivation, wider determinants of health, things like that. So it's never a case of just policy interventions. Those are not the only things going on in the world. There's lots of other things happening as well, and it's very difficult, therefore, to talk about using just this data to talk about the effectiveness of interventions, because it's difficult to be certain about what the counterfactual would have been. Having said all of that, when we look at this data, it's definitely, we wouldn't say that its harm's going down. Definitely not. I think we can be quite confident about that. It definitely does kind of. We have always renewed it. We have always used it to renew GambleAware's policy asks, and definitely we remain keen for to see those policy asks implemented. So things that we are still keen to see. And I think those asks are reinforced by the data that we've shown you today. Things that we're keen to see are tougher regulation of gambling advertising. I think there is, GambleAware has been consistently clear to say that there is more work to be done on that, to reduce the normalization of it, but also to stop it being portrayed as harmless fun, as it sometimes tends to be. We've done work to show that the current kind of safer gambling messages, that accompany that are used by are used within gambling marketing are pretty not very effective, not effective at all, and needs to be replaced by health warnings, things like that. So that's another thing that we continue to call for. We definitely want to see stricter controls on digital and social media marketing, particularly strict to children and young people. And we've done lots of work. We produced some research recently on issues that we're concerned about, like the use of celebrities in gambling marketing, celebrity appeal, content marketing, things like that, which we think is potentially having a very damaging effect. And there needs to be much tighter regulation around that. We've seen some evidence today, some data on public attitudes towards gambling marketing, including in sports, and we would be in favour of a full ban on gambling promotion in stadiums and sports venues to protect people from harm. So it's not just front of shirt sleeve, things like that, but all throughout stadia, that we think that is needed. Right, they're coming through thick and fast now. Let me just see if there's another one. Right, another question has come through. What's the recommendations for the report for ensuring long-term support for individuals who've experienced gambling harm? I think YouGov have I might bring you on this. I think the research provides a lot of that, but I think just in a general sense, we, as I said in my kind of opening remarks, tackling. We know that there's tackling stigma is really essential. We know that providing support that meets people where they are is really essential, and we know that enabling support, finding a way to support people who want to quit on their own or reduce gambling on their own is really helpful. Those are things that I have always found particularly striking from all of the research that YouGov have done for us. But I'll give Kate and Jack an opportunity to chime in with anything else they want to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would really just echo what you said, Haroon, as well as I think people really show an appetite for support that's free, it's confidential and discreet. People are coming from all different angles. Some people are willing to be more open about the gambling, whereas other people want to hide it entirely. So there needs to be support out there for people that can really meet them, like Haroon said, meet them where they're at. And support as well that's really flexible. So remote options, in-person options. People spoke about sometimes needing 24/7 support. And that could come in many different forms. So I think it really is about offering a very holistic array of different services for people and services that can cater to them as like individual people rather than an idea of who this person might be.
Great, thanks. We've got time for one last question, a very quick one. Someone has asked, will the presentation be made available for download after the meeting? And yes, we can definitely do that. All right, we are pretty much out of time, but there is one last thing for me to tell you about, which it would be remiss of me not to plug some other bits of GambleAware work coming up in the near future that I think people might be interested to know about. We are running an event to showcase some of our most recent research grants that we have published using funding from the Gambling Commission, and that is on the 2nd of December. Which might be of interest, and that's a really wide range of research grants on various topics there. The GambleAware annual conference, there's a typo on the slide, that is not the 7th of December, it's the 10th of December, Wednesday the 10th of December. Please mark that in your diaries if you haven't done so already. And still time to register for that, and that will be our final GambleAware conference. And the theme is celebrating progress and welcoming the new statutory gambling harms prevention system. And lastly, we have some upcoming reports that we'll be publishing soon, wrapping up some additional bits of data to really build up the evidence base and provide the future system with even more evidence to tackle and support gambling harms and support people who are experiencing it. So stay tuned for all of this. A few more things to come from us. Right. I think I will leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I wish you all a pleasant day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.